across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. It is our weekend edition, and we have a lot to cover. As a matter of fact, some people are saying there is probably too much to cover in 2 hours, but we're going to do our best. Of course, very first in front, we're going to be talking about the Republican primary in South Carolina. We'll also be talking about the Democratic caucus in Nevada. Then they switch, and then you're going to have a Republican caucus in Nevada next week. And then, of course, next Saturday, you will have the Democratic primary. If that's not enough, of course, you had some of the conversation we had yesterday about the Pope and what he had to say about Donald Trump. We also are going to be looking at how the media has been covering this whole issue of whether or not this president or the next president should actually. If that's not enough, we might get into a whole variety of other issues. Apple and their unwillingness to cooperate with the FBI on the Apple phone and much, much more. So there are lots of things to talk about. And around the round table, first of all, we have Debbie Georgatos, a host of Ladies Can We Talk, author of the book. And it is great to see you back here as well.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
And you actually have had some medical issues, as we like to say here. You broke something.
I did. You know, it's a great thing. I did break my leg, but my voice works. I can read, I can think, so it's just a leg. But yes, it's slowing me down a little bit.
It's slowing you down. Not much. To talk about slowing you down is not something most of us think about. And we are going to welcome to the microphone for the first time an individual that we certainly hope you'll hear from in the future. That's Chelsey Youman, and she is the Chief of Staff and Counsel for First Liberty Institute. And Debbie, you weren't here when last week we actually announced that First Liberty is the same thing as Liberty Institute, but they've changed their name. And she is a graduate of Texas A&M, Gig'em, as well as a graduate of SMU Law School. You've been an intern with them. And matter of fact, I remember years ago, you came to this studio to watch Kelly Shackelford when you were an intern at SMU Law School. And now here you are, right, sitting in front of us. So.
That's right. It's great to be on this side of the glass and get to participate in the discussion today.
She's also been a member, of course, of the Aggie Law Society and the SMU Christian Legal Society. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of her background in just a few minutes. But Debbie and Chelsey, let's talk about South Carolina. We have a lot of listeners there. And as of yesterday, 38,000 absentee ballots have been cast in the Republican contest. Last time we had anything near that number was in 2008, and there were 35,000. And the number is still going up. So this looks like you have a record turnout for the Republican primary this week. And I'm going to look ahead in a little bit. The Democratic primary next week looks like it might have a record turnout as well. The turnout record in 2012 was 583,000 votes in that primary, and we'll see where that goes. But it seems like more and more individuals are turning out either to vote for Donald Trump or to vote against Donald Trump. So it'll be interesting to see what happens Saturday night.
That's exactly what it is. You know, as a close political observer, I've commented over the last year or so many times, Donald Trump is kind of a flash in the pan. He's got a big personality. He's said a couple of popular things. It is truly, this entire election season is really novel. I mean, Donald Trump is a true, complete outsider to the process. He leads in the national polls. It just seems no matter what he says. And so this is really interesting because you hear people who are the strong GOP primary voters saying, I'd never vote for him. I wouldn't do it no matter what. But he keeps on showing these record numbers. So it's going to be interesting because one thing that's at play in South Carolina and will be on the March 1st primaries is the role of the evangelical vote, the Christian vote.
True, yes.
Yeah, South Carolina is huge. We can talk about maybe what Ted Cruz has been up to along those lines, trying to galvanize the evangelical vote in South Carolina.
Sure. Well, and you have a Sunday night talk show. What a perfect time for you to give a full analysis of what happened Saturday night.
I can hardly wait. Yes, it will be one of the main topics. I will tell you also, I hope it's okay to say, I was invited to be on Inside Texas on Sunday morning, the TV show here,
Sure.
talking about South Carolina. So I'm going to stay up until the bitter end, get get the last numbers, the last commentary, and be ready to roll Sunday morning.
Chelsey, you can see that even though she's got a broken leg, it really doesn't slow her down very much.
Not at all. Not at all.
Any thoughts you have about the importance of South Carolina so far?
Well, I think it's a pivotal race, but I think the other story is the contenders right under Donald Trump in the race. Ted Cruz and Rubio are at it fierce this week. We've seen a lot shaping up in ads, both political, both ways. They're, I think, at this point, have a 1-point margin between the two, 18.1% and 17%. So that will be interesting to see how that plays out as well.
I would think so. And
you know, it's a great statistic I saw recently, relevant what you just said, Chelsey, is that there was polling done. If it were only Donald Trump and Marco Rubio would beat Donald Trump. If it were only Donald Trump and Ted Cruz would beat Donald Trump. So both of those second tier, I mean, they're fabulous candidates, but Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio could decide, for the sake of the country, I'm going to get out because Trump could be so harmful to our country. I don't see that happening, but it's an amazing statistic.
Let me talk about that, and I will even hold this up for people to see, and then I'll hand it to Debbie because I know she's going to want to use it Sunday night. They not only in the last poll ask who's your first choice, but who is your second choice. Now, first choice, of course, Donald Trump, 36%, Ted Cruz, 17%, Marco Rubio, 15%. But then when they ask second choice, that's the point you're making. 24% said Marco Rubio. So the point is that even for individuals that might vote for Donald Trump, if he were not there, they would vote for, in order, Marco Rubio, then Ted Cruz, and then, interesting enough, Ben Carson, even though he's further down the list, only probably will poll, if this poll is correct, maybe only 9 or 10%. He's still a fairly significant third choice for individuals in South Carolina, if these polls mean anything. And of course, we know how little these polls sometimes mean, right?
They do mean little. And you know, it's another interesting kind of turn on statistics. I do love statistics about elections, but what another thing that poll is saying is over 60% of the voters in South Carolina are not making Donald Trump their first choice. But this is a problem because there are so many people in the race this time. You mentioned Ben Carson, Jeb Bush still staying in. You know, these are people who at some point, and many people are thinking perhaps South Carolina will be the end of the line for Jeb Bush and Ben Carson unless they have some amazing surge. And I think the voters need to help. They need the whole race honed down. They really do. And I think this is because I still question whether a majority of Republicans actually want Donald Trump, or is he just getting the plurality given the large number of people in the race.
Well, again, you look at a Jeb Bush, a Ben Carson, a John Kasich, each one of them have some kind of second choice, but there are just too many other people in the race, and as a result, they get squeezed out. And I think, what do you think, Chelsey? Do you think that maybe somebody will drop out of South Carolina?
I think that's a definite possibility. However, I do see Jeb Bush holding out maybe a little bit longer, at least until the March primaries go underway in the Deep South, and see how those turn out. But in addition, what we haven't talked about is a possibility of a brokered convention this summer, which does incentivize some of these candidates to stay in the race longer than they traditionally would have, to see how many of those delegates get to be free.
Well, let's talk about that because we are going to give you the delegate count, and we'll talk about that after the break. But also today's Salon saying Hillary Clinton just can't win. Democrats, the GOP. Now, this is a liberal organization, to put it mildly, and this is, I think, the crack in the actual statue of Hillary Clinton, or the road bump along the way on the coronation for Hillary Clinton. And there are a lot of people wondering whether she is going to make it to the finish line. So we'll talk about that. And of course, give you a chance to join our conversation today. Privileged to have in studio with us today, David Georgatos, as well as Chelsey Youman. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll have more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Seth Shostak believes that this could be humanity's last century, but don't think that he's a pessimist. He's the director of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence and warns us about potential dangers on the horizon, but also explains that our 21st century technology holds great promise. He believes we will be able to understand biology at the molecular level. That will give humanity the ability to cure all diseases, but it will also usher in an era of designer babies. He believes we will eventually produce offspring that are as different from us as dogs are from gray wolves. He also believes that we will expand into space to obtain additional resources such as copper, zinc, and platinum. Humanity might establish colonies on the moon or Mars. We might also develop huge orbiting habitats in space. He also predicts that we will develop generalized artificial intelligence. This will allow machines to take over jobs normally done by humans, and it is impossible, at least in the near future, that robotics will be so advanced that it will be difficult to tell the difference between who is a real human and who is a machine. If his predictions are true, and I believe they're fairly accurate, then we will need wisdom and morality to guide us through these new advances. Put simply, we need Christian ethics and morality like never before. Unfortunately, the moral foundation behind much of these technological advances is a secular humanistic one. We need Christians in the fields of science and engineering to provide moral reflection. And we cannot retreat into a belief that Jesus will return before all of these technologies are developed. He may not return when we think that he might. We should not be preoccupied with his coming. We need to occupy until he comes. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Columbia Pictures, LD Entertainment, and Affirm Films present Risen, the resurrection through the eyes of a non-believer. Risen, rated PG-13 in theaters February 19th.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. In studio with us today, Debbie Georgatos, as well as Chelsey Youman. And just a little bit later, Kyle Drennen is going to be joining us. He's with the Media Research Center, and we'll get into this whole issue about the liberal bias against the idea that some Republicans have floated of let's just wait till this election and then determine who will be the successor to Antonin Scalia. There are times in which the Supreme Court has functioned quite well with 8 justices rather than 9, and so we'll see how that all plays out in just a minute. Before we take some phone calls, though, let's talk about the delegate count, because a lot of people think, well, is it over after South Carolina? My answer is not really, not even close, because what you have in South Carolina are 50 delegates up for grabs. And just to help you understand, in the Republican side, Donald Trump has 17, Ted Cruz has 11, Marco Rubio has 10, and we can work all the way down the list. Well, you need 1,237 delegates, so it's not over after South Carolina. I'm not so sure it's over after March 1st, because you have 12 primaries plus a caucus. Our listeners up there in Alaska get to have a Republican caucus. And, of course, at that point, let's just use, since we're in the state of Texas, the fact that in Texas you have 155 delegates up for grabs, which is more than the entire total of the delegates up for grabs in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada. So let's at least recognize that, yes, there may be some candidates that might drop out. But in terms of the delegate count, Debbie, we're a long way before they end up in Cleveland, right?
We are a very long way, and I do think, I think some people have a bit of debate fatigue, but debates happen, new debates are coming, people watch candidates, they all of a sudden realize, you know what, I do like this about him, or I don't like this about him. There's a lot that can change things. I mean, there are just a lot of things that can, among the contenders who are at the higher levels with Trump and Cruz and Rubio, yeah, things can shift.
Chelsey, let me come to you, because Kelly Shackelford last week set me down and said, no, because I talked about the possibility of a brokered convention, and, I'm not going to disagree with Kelly Shackelford, even if I know I'm right. But now I have somebody else that says, it's at least a theoretical possibility that if they keep splitting this across 5 candidates or 3 candidates, no one could come to Cleveland with 1,237 delegates, and then you'd have a brokered convention, right?
That's right. I think it's it's almost a fun possibility to play out, as it hasn't happened, I think, since the 40s. So it's been the first time, certainly in my lifetime, that would be a possibility. And I do think that with this many candidates still in play, still gaining delegate votes, that they might hold out longer than they otherwise would have dropped out, after Super Tuesday in March. And we would typically know by April who our candidate is. But at this rate we're going, I think it is somewhat a possibility that we might end up with a brokered convention.
Well, again, a lot of people say, why doesn't Ben Carson drop out? Well, first of all, we all like Ben Carson. I've had him on the program probably more than any other of the candidates. And second of all, he's free to stay in there as long as he wants. And Ben Carson has a couple of delegates. He's going to pick up a few more in South Carolina, it looks like. So why not stay in? It's a good question.
For our listeners, I think people probably all know what a brokered convention is, but all the idea is if no one has enough votes to win the first vote, people show up at the convention, they cast their ballots, there is no winner, and then it becomes, people will say, a free-for-all, it's a negotiating, and really that comes down to who has the most power to convince other delegates, or persuadability, who's got the great arguments, who's got the talking points. And so people early on had been fretting or almost excited about the idea of a brokered convention because maybe it's an argument of ideas. I know the Donald Trump campaign has already been talking about, the GOP, don't you dare turn on me if I'm close. But, if someone's very close but doesn't quite have the votes to pass, then maybe this brokered convention thing would be a short story, But if there are a lot of people in similar numbers, it could be a real battle within for the heart and soul of the GOP, really.
Absolutely. And furthermore, I think Jeb Bush might be a little more incentivized to make it to the convention because he has quite a few allies, obviously, there. So it would be very interesting play out to see that come about.
If Donald Trump does win, and we are going to get a lot of these winner-take-all various primaries later on, then you have to say, who would actually be invited to speak at the convention? Do you think Jeb Bush would speak on behalf of Donald Trump? I think we know the answer to that. He called Ted Cruz a liar so many times. I don't think Ted Cruz would want to, nor do I think he'd pick him. So that would be an interesting kind of scenario to play out as well.
Sarah Palin.
Yeah, maybe it would
be. There was also this discussion, and I will confess, I didn't read this. My husband, who's equally involved in all these things I work on, he read something that talked about Trump being recently asked who he might consider for a vice president, and he actually included Cruz in the list, Cruz and Rubio. And this is after he's called him a liar how many times? I don't even, it's like he's able to say these things and then it's kind of, oh, wow, that's just campaign talk. Come on. It's a very hard thing to imagine him finding a VP candidate. I think it's a challenge, unless I can think of a few.
One of the reasons he wouldn't pick Cruz is, and I want to get to one of our callers, is that he's not convinced that he's actually eligible to run. Remember that whole conversation as well?
Well, perhaps a Supreme Court nomination would be a good way to to appease both parties.
Let's take that one right now, because we'll go to South Carolina, which is what we're going to be watching South Carolina tomorrow for a lot of very good reasons. First, for the Republican primary, and the next week for the Democratic primary. Bruce, I know you're in South Carolina, WAGP. What are your questions for us today?
Well, thank you for taking my call. I know it's a little off the subject from what you first stated, but I have heard on the news that there's been a lawsuit filed to dispute Ted Cruz's citizenship. Now, I know a lot of ink was spilled and breath expelled on the citizenship of Barack Obama, and I'm interested, since you have a couple of lawyers there, what is the difference in the legal facts between the two cases? I would really like to know. I mean, if we're disputing Ted Cruz, we certainly have a more of a standing in my mind of disputing Barack Obama's. I realize now it's a moot point, but
sure.
That's my question. I also would like to say that I think Donald Trump would be a nightmare as a president. Absolute nightmare.
And one of our other callers wants to actually talk about Donald Trump, so we'll give you a positive and a negative. Let's talk about this first. This is a lawsuit that was brought in the state of Illinois, simply by an individual that actually is a Ben Carson supporter, just saying this is going to be an issue and it needs to be resolved, and so it will be resolved. The argument that is made is that Donald Trump made is that it was the same. I would say for just a minute there are some real differences, because if you even assume, and I disagree with this, if you assume that Barack Obama was born in Kenya, you could say, well, yes, but he had a mother that was an American citizen, but she did not qualify in terms of the amount of residency. So some people have said that's different, even if he was born in Kenya. I'm not sure that he was. The issue with Ted Cruz that the argument is made is that he was born in Canada, and his mother was indeed an American citizen, and nobody disputes that. I think if you go back to the original founders, some of them might have said he wasn't a natural-born citizen, but we've had so much law since then that almost everybody, including people like Paul Clement, who has argued all sorts of cases before the Supreme Court, and others have written pieces saying that this is a non-issue. But I think there's some value, don't you think, Debbie, in having this finally resolved in at least the court there in Illinois so that it's no longer hanging over the head of Ted Cruz?
The problem is even a judgment in the state of Illinois would not convince other people. People want to say, I want to hear the U.S. Supreme Court. That's the final arbiter, and this is a constitutional question, and they're the final arbiter. And so you'd be great. Was challenged, and in each of those cases, the states reviewed and said, yes, he meets the standard natural-born citizen. I worry that this case needs to move expeditiously to the Supreme Court. And then I worry about the Supreme Court without Justice Scalia there, how they're going to go on it. I do think it'd be a great thing to have a final decision of what that provision means, because it may happen again and again in America. And it's not a settled question of law. Now, I will say many of the people who are even saying it's not a settled question of law, actual constitutional authorities, Harvard type people, say the better judgment, the weight of opinion, the most likely outcome is, yes, you do meet the standard of natural-born citizen of one of your parents was a citizen when you were born, so he should meet that standard, but it's an unsettled area of law. It's a toughie.
You know, we've had Joseph Farah on this program before, and he said, we really just don't have any way to actually vet the candidates. And that came up, of course, with Barack Obama, and it's surfaced again. And it just seems to me that there could be some kind of system like that, and a Supreme Court decision certainly would be helpful, wouldn't it?
Okay, I have a point to make totally seriously. The very first president of the United States was born before the United States existed. So actually, technically, he doesn't meet natural born citizen because there was no, I'm serious. People making these arguments. Several of the early presidents were born before the United States existed. So they were therefore not, I'm getting at saying that this notion, I think what they were trying to avoid in the Constitution was having truly someone who was a foreign power, someone perhaps.
John Jay started all this thing. John Jay wrote to George Washington, but it said if you were present at the time in which the Constitution was ratified. So they did bring those in, but a lot of people wondered whether Alexander Hamilton was born in the Caribbean. So we have a lot more to talk about. We'll do that right after these important messages.
Columbia Pictures and LD Entertainment, in association with Affirm Films, the studio that brought you Heaven is for Real and War Room, comes Risen, the biblical story of the resurrection as told through the eyes of a non-believer.
The body has vanished.
His tomb is empty.
Risen, starring Joseph Fiennes, rated PG-13, may be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at risen-movie.com.
Are you concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, and the halls of government? Let me ask, have you invested in things that yield a good harvest? If you're already giving to Point of View each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition. If you'd like to join our conversation, we'll take some more phone calls in just a minute. But we wanted to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court vacancy next week. Of course, the United States Senate is back in session. And I think we already are hearing a lot of noise about the fact that the senators have to confirm a nominee. This is why we wanted to talk about this, because interestingly enough, and I know that Debbie Georgatos has a lot to say about it because you've been doing interviews on this for days on Fox News and all sorts of things, about the fact that on one hand, you have Senator Schumer back in July of 2007 promised to block any Supreme Court nominee put forward by George W. Bush. Yet he was on the Talking Head shows last weekend talking about the obstructionism, and this kind of obstructionism isn't going to last. So we're going to look at this from a political point of view, and then Kyle Drennen joining us, we're going to look at it from a media point of view. But what about this? First of all, even before Antonin Scalia's body was moved, you already have people saying, oh, now there's an opportunity for President Barack Obama to put another liberal on the court.
Exactly. And one point I've thought about many times this week is if you don't really follow Supreme Court or, jurisprudence that much, it might seem like, look, if President Obama nominates someone who has judicial experience, was a good law student, is an honest person, has no bad things in their background, what difference does it make? Isn't it kind of interchangeable? But the truth is the Supreme Court is deeply divided right now, and the essential division relates to whether people think the Constitution should be followed as written, or whether the Supreme Court should act in a more almost legislative fashion and ignore the words of the Constitution or contort them or add. This is what the reason is such a debate, because you can have a brilliant lawyer who holds to the Constitution and would be a good judge, and a brilliant lawyer who's very anti-Constitution. And this is why there's so much turmoil over this, because in America, the Constitution is like the structural supports for a bridge. You have to have the Constitution in place. And this is something the American left, and certainly President Obama, does not agree with. In fact, during his many years earlier, President Obama said in an interview, he criticized the Constitution as a charter of negative liberties, basically saying it irritated him that the Constitution didn't give the federal government more power to do whatever it wanted to do. So it is a consequential decision, probably the most consequential decision the Senate will make the entire year of 2016, is whether to even hold a hearing for a nominee President Obama makes for the Supreme Court. Because if you get another person on, like a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who just thinks their role is kind of to be the ultimate legislature, the course of the guarantees and all of the Bill of Rights, the guarantees that the Constitution gives us, the Bill of Rights give us, will not be upheld by this court. It'll be a left-wing court, and it will have consequences in the decisions they issue for decades.
Chelsey, for First Liberty, and we just been talking about the fact that Liberty Institute is now called First Liberty, you've got to say right now, for many of the justices that are up there, and then looking at all your lawyers at First Liberty, if you have to fight the next religious liberty case before a court that is packed against you, it's not going to bode well, is it?
You're absolutely right. And first and foremost, I just want to say that, our nation is grieving, and we at First Liberty are grieving the loss of Justice Scalia. He was a very principled constitutionalist, lawyer, and then Supreme Court justice. And so we're not just mourning a man, which his family is mourning. We're mourning a Supreme Court justice who laid 30 years worth of very strong Supreme Court precedent for us. Great constitutionalist. And further, what we're talking about is changing the makeup of the ideology on this court for a lifetime, potentially. This is not just one judge or liberals versus conservatives right now. What we're talking about is changing jurisprudence for the First Amendment, which is what we exclusively work with, is freedom of religion for a lifetime. And this is in an election year where the First Amendment is one of the major platforms that we are discussing, and all of the candidates are discussing, just the increase in attacks against religious liberty. And we have many, many important precedent landmark cases going to the Supreme Court this session that Scalia will now not be there to help decide.
Say a couple other quick things. The Constitution, in the founders' brilliance, balances the power as it attempted to in many ways, and it provides that the president has the sole authority to nominate Supreme Court justices, all federal court judges. The president has that responsibility and right. On the other, and the Senate has the responsibility to decide whether or not to hold a hearing and whether or not to confirm. There is no imperative in the Constitution or anywhere else that says the president must nominate right now. He could hold off. He would not be violating the law or the Constitution, and the senators could decline to hold and to even hold a hearing. There is no constitutional or legal imperative to hold a hearing or to confirm. And so it really it's an intended balance of power between the framers created. And at this point in American history, the GOP controlled Senate needs to hold strong and just say, we're going to wait and find out. And the real thing is, a new president selected by the voters in 2016, in office in 2017, let the new president make a nomination, because it's really giving the people of America a role in selecting that nominee.
And I will add to that the American people decided in 2014 to give the Senate to the Republicans. They have spoken on this issue that the American people want the Republicans to be balancing out the president and his vast overreach of his executive power that he's consistently implemented for years.
Let's, if we can, then bring to the microphone now. How has the media been covering this? I think we already know the answer, but we go to Kyle Drennen, who serves as the news analyst for the Media Research Center. He's also a contributing writer to Newsbusters. I really would encourage you to go there. And oftentimes the analysis that they have provided has been cited by people like Rush Limbaugh and Mark Levin and others. Kyle is a graduate of Providence College and joins us now by phone. Kyle, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. Thanks for having me on.
Talk about some of the media coverage here. We just talked a minute ago about what some people call the Schumer precedent, and that is in 2007, he said, no, we're not going to consider in the last 18 months of President Bush's time in office, any Supreme Court nominee. We're maybe, 10 months away from the next election. Have the media been pointing those kinds of things out?
Well, no, they have not. And on Monday, just taking ABC and NBC, their evening newscasts, their morning newscasts, said nothing. They didn't bother to point out anything about Chuck Schumer's hypocrisy on this issue, the fact that he's completely changed his point of view on Supreme Court nominations in the past decade. And so, yeah, that was not something that they were interested in covering one bit.
You also have one from the New York Times, the editorial board member, who is really arguing that President Obama should be able to have a nominee and, if anything, give Obama the court nominee he wants because of slavery. Explain that one.
Yeah, this was a tweet that a member of the editorial board of the New York Times sent out just right after Scalia's death. Basically, quoting it here, in a nation built on slavery, white men proposed denying the first black president his constitutional right to name Supreme Court nominee. Now, that tweet was so bad, and he thought better of it. He later deleted that tweet, but we did manage to capture it before he did. But that's just sort of that's the mentality. It's if the media can find a way to call Republicans racist somehow, even though the Senate is obviously exercising their constitutional obligation of advising consent, president can nominate, but they have a right to say, well, we're not on board with this. But if the media can find an opportunity to call Republicans racist over something, they'll seize it.
I might just mention, too, that if you want some of these articles, first of all, we have a link to Kyle. You can just click on where his picture is, and it will take you to mrc.org, which is, of course, Media Research Center, or you can go directly to Newsbusters. And as he said, they captured this one because now you won't be able to find it. But whether you look at the ABC-NBC flip-flop and the whole issue of Chuck Schumer and his hypocrisy, or the issue of the New York Times editorial board member, give Obama a court nominee he wants because of slavery. I always like to bring these here when Kelly Shackler's on because his head explodes. This case, I think Debbie's head exploded on that. And Kyle, we need to take one of those mandatory breaks because I want to get back to a couple of others that you have dug up. And again, I just encourage people to go to Newsbusters. They do such a good job. We're going to talk about MSNBC, talking about the Washington Post and a couple of others, but we've already given a little bit of grief to ABC, NBC, and the New York Times, but we have a few more that we thought we would mention. And of course, we'll go around the table as well to talk about this issue of the open vacancy. And we might even jump back to, does anybody remember Judge Robert Bork? Remember those? So we'll get into that as well. Again, I'm getting Debbie's head explode. This is fun, so we will come back and take some of these phone calls of yours. And a little bit later, we'll come back to what's happening in South Carolina, what's happening in Nevada. And of course, we have yet to even talk about the Pope and Donald Trump. We will not get all of this in, even with our electronic shoehorn today, but we will do our best. And so if you would like to know a little bit more about the Media Research Center, if you'd like to know more about Kyle Drennen, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. That has all the links. And as you read some of these, I believe, especially the one from the New York Times, you will shake your head and roll your eyes. We'll have some more right after this.
I never thought I'd hear conservatives vying to show who is most supportive of registering young women for the draft, but it happened in a recent GOP presidential debate. The question was relevant because recently all restrictions against allowing women to be assigned to combat positions were lifted. Certain military leaders are talking about requiring women to sign up for selective service just as men do. It's the logical next step because the 1981 court decision prohibiting drafting women was based upon their exclusion from combat. Here's the question ABC News debate moderator Martha Raddatz directed at Marco Rubio. Many of you have young daughters. Senator Rubio, should young women be required to sign up for selective service in case of a national emergency? He prefaced his response with support for women serving in combat as long as standards are not compromised, and then continued, I do believe that selective service should be opened up for both men and women in case a draft is ever instituted. Martha Raddatz turned the question to Jeb Bush, asking him, do you believe that young women should sign up for selective service, be required to do so? Governor Bush answered, I do. His answer communicated that he does not think the draft will be reinstated, and there was an exchange about military readiness and morale. And then Chris Christie jumped in, mentioning he's the father of 2 daughters, and, quote, there is no reason why one young woman should be discriminated against from registering for the selective service. It's not about discriminating against women. It's about requiring them, making them sign up for selective service, so that if we ever have a draft again, they could be drafted. Political correctness has run amok in the military, so I'm not shocked the idea of drafting women is being floated. But for mainstream politicians to accept the idea that we, as a country, would ever force women into military service and into harm's way in combat positions is, to say the least, worrisome. Ted Cruz wasn't asked about drafting women that night. He told his audience at a town hall a few days later that as his fellow candidates answered the question, he was thinking, are you guys nuts? He said the idea that we would draft our daughters to forcibly bring them into the military and put them in close combat, I think, is wrong. It is immoral. It's been 40 years since we had a military draft in this country. There's currently no sign that will reinstate the draft. Congress is supposed to approve or disapprove. Congressman Duncan Hunter, a Marine veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, introduced the Draft America's Daughters Act, not to pass it, but to start discussion so this isn't forced on the country. We must never draft America's daughters. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, we're going to get to your phone calls in just a minute, but we have in studio with us today David Georgatos and Chelsey Youman, as well as Kyle Drennen. And Kyle, just before we wind this down, let's talk about some of the whining over there at MSNBC, because I thought this was kind of interesting as well. They're really fearful that the Republican Party is going to take over the Supreme Court, aren't they?
Well, basically, right after Scalia's passing over the weekend, the chief legal analyst over at MSNBC was really very much afraid of Republicans blocking Obama appointing a nominee to the Supreme Court and confirming a nominee because, in his words, it would keep the Supreme Court from, quote, governing the country in the meantime.
So we would be really hurt by only having 8. And after all, the Republicans have exerted so much influence over the Supreme Court, right?
Right. But it's just it's one of those things where it's like, your chief legal expert is under the impression that the Supreme Court's job is to govern the country. Supreme Court's job is actually just to interpret the Constitution and make rulings on those matters. But from the liberal perspective, it's, well, no, they govern the country, and so if there's only 8 justices instead of 9 justices, they can't effectively govern the country the way people at MSNBC would like them to.
Well, one more. You have the Washington Post headline with the death of Antonin Scalia. And, it's interesting because after he died, there were some really harsh things said about him on social media. Well, let's just be honest. Ruth Bader Ginsburg doesn't agree with him on anything, but whether it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg or even the President Obama, they had some very positive things to say about Antonin Scalia, but you didn't necessarily pick that up from this Washington Post headline, did you?
No, this Washington Post headline was really quite astonishing. The very next day, on Sunday, their headline is Supreme Court Conservative Dismayed Liberals. I mean, right off the bat, their main takeaway, the main thing that they think is the most important aspect of Scalia's passing is that he dismayed liberals. He made liberals feel dismayed is the most important thing that they are concerned about. Not simply his life and his legacy, but how liberals felt about him.
Oh, well, again, you have done such a good job of pulling some of this together, and I certainly appreciate the Media Research Center, but also people can go to Newsbusters and find some of these articles because there's going to be an ongoing discussion and debate about this. But if anybody wants to at least be able to make the case that, once again, we have a mainstream media that isn't very fair about these issues, what can they find when they go to newsbusters.org or mrc.org?
Well, they can find the latest media analysis. We're covering the news 24/7, and so the minute we see something, we'll have it up on Newsbusters on mrc.org right away. mrc.org is particularly good to see some of our long-term studies and special reports and things of that nature as well.
So again, I appreciate you joining us here today on Point of View, and I always encourage people to find out more about the Media Research Center and also to find those great articles in Newsbusters. So, Kyle, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's, if we can, take some phone calls along the way. We'll head up to New Hampshire, although we've already had a primary there. I'd like to always hear from some of our listeners there as well. WSEW, Vinny, what would you like to add to the conversation today?
Yeah, I wanted to thank you guys very much. You guys have been doing a great job covering this Supreme Court issue with regard to when Bork was nominated and Chuck Schumer and all were fighting that nomination. But the only thing I wanted to add is that President Obama himself said elections have consequences. So in 2014, the Republicans took over the Senate, and in my opinion, it's their duty, it's their responsibility not to allow President Obama to put someone else on the Supreme Court bench.
Yes.
It's that simple.
Yep. And again, when people use that argument, elections have consequences, we'll say, well, certainly the election for president in 2012 have consequences, but the election of Republicans in the Senate in 2014 have consequences. And back to the point that you made, Debbie, just a minute ago, we make available, of course, pocket copies of the Constitution. And if you read Article 2, Section 2, it doesn't say that the Supreme Court has to rubber stamp the president's nomination. This is not an imperative. This is advise and consent, is it not?
Yes, and the Senate actually needs to, as many of you may recall, watching hearings over the years, there were some famous ones that went on for quite a long time, like Clarence Thomas. They investigate, they ask what they think, they try to look for biases. I mean, it really is a job to give a substantive examination of the president's nominee, and then the Senate finishes that. It's often televised, and so the American people get a chance to see, and the Senate does. And then they decide, and they are perfectly free under the Constitution to say no. To decline to confirm this person, and the president just has to come up with someone new, as Republican presidents have had to do many times, and as President Obama may face. I really hope the Senate doesn't even hold hearings. I think that'd be a strategic mistake.
Let's take another phone call real quickly, since I have two lawyers here. Carrie in Kentucky would like to ask a question, so put your question on the table if you might.
Hi, hello.
Yes, what would you like to ask?
Hi, my name's Terry. I'm from Kentucky.
Uh-huh.
I'm 9 years old, and I'm just wondering if you would be able to get over to the other side of the table and kick that girl.
Well, I think she was going to ask what age does someone need to be on the Supreme Court, but there is no requirement for that, is there?
Not of which I'm aware. I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. You know, you can be of any age. And as a matter of fact, oftentimes, she, actually didn't get a chance to ask her question, but that was a question she had. And that, I think, would be something to think about, though. Somebody that brings a little bit of age and experience. Well, it doesn't work so well when you have a president that really hasn't been in office very long. I've sort of seen that one play out. Wouldn't be real good to have somebody on the Supreme Court that doesn't at least have a legal experience and maybe shows some time in which he or she has had some judgment. We've had some people on the court that probably didn't belong there because they just really hadn't understood some of these legal issues in an effective way, right?
Exactly. And really, there is a mission for courts. It's very different from practicing law, different from all sorts of other law. In courts, you have a certain arena you're supposed to be ruling in. You're supposed to be deciding the case in front of you, and the Supreme Court based on precedent and based on the Constitution. So I think some experience, especially someone who's a lawyer and has been kind of only an advocate, you want them to have had experience in the role of a judge. It's a different role.
I think our Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, got it right when he equated this to a balance of power issue. We've seen what kind of nominees that Obama puts on the court. We've seen extensive overreach in his executive decisions, executive amnesty, passing the Iran deal without getting the requisite number of votes from Congress. I mean, he has a history of appointing people to the Supreme Court who think it's their jobs to be legislatures. And it's okay, I think, in this case for Congress to try to balance that out.
And, even the sitting Supreme Court with Scalia still on it ruled against President Obama in his using his appointment power in an abusive manner. He waited. There's a permission when the Senate is in recess if there's a need to make an appointment. And President Obama abused that. And even this court with 2 nominees on that he appointed and 4 on the liberal side gave 9-0, took away President Obama's appointments to the National Labor Relations Board. He has a history of using the appointment power for political reasons. There's no reason the Senate can't keep that in mind, deciding how to handle this.
Some people have asked, well, is it possible that after he steps down, he could be a Supreme Court nominee? Because you had William Howard Taft, who was president and later became the Chief Justice of the United States. But if you want to put him on the court and the courts voted against him 9-0, you can see that he might have changed it to 8-1 if he were on the court. But we will see. And that, again, shows that elections have consequences. The next president, if he or she is a Democrat, might put somebody like Eric Holder or Loretta Lynch or even Barack Obama on the court. If he is a Republican, I'm thinking they're going to come up with different kind of candidates. So we'll see how that plays itself out. We need to take a break, though. We have lots of phone calls. There are all sorts of issues we haven't even covered yet, but the first hour is up. We'll take on some of those other issues in the second hour right after this.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, almost a full bank of phone calls. So as a caller drops off, you can join the conversation. Debbie Georgatos and Chelsey Youman with us today. And of course, we're looking to South Carolina. And as I look, most of my calls are from South Carolina. So I always like to kind of put some of our South Carolinians up first anyway, but especially since we've been talking about the possible successor to Antonin Scalia, let's take some of those calls first from South Carolina. WLPE in South Carolina. Eileen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kerby. Yes, I understood the justice is blind. And I have not seen that from the Supreme Court justices at all. They should not have a personal opinion or a political leaning. They're there to vet the outcome of a case according to the Constitution.
Yes.
And I don't agree with lifetime placements. There should be a term limit put on them because they are, as we saw with Obamacare, that wasn't exactly the way it should have turned out if you look at what Roberts did the night before and then rewrote his opinion.
Very, very, very insightful. Let me take both points real quickly, and that is, first of all, when we say that individuals should look at the text of the Constitution, there was a piece that came out in the Wall Street Journal, and I've mentioned it once. I've got a commentary coming out next week in which it quotes from that, but they went back and looked at this and said, not since Justice Byron White, now he was a justice back in the 1970s, not since Byron White retired has any Democratic appointee broken with the liberal lockstep on issues that truly matter to the left. So, in other words, they don't look at it in terms of, well, maybe it's a possibility that even though I would like it to come out one way, I need to be true to the Constitution and go another way. They have always voted in lockstep. By contrast, they pointed out that many Republican appointees, Harry Blackmun, John Paul Stevens, David Souter, all the time, Sandra Day O'Connor, Anthony Kennedy, often, John Roberts, and even in one case, Antonin Scalia, actually did break with conservative political preferences on major legal issues. So when it comes especially to the Democratic appointees, the four that we've talked about in the past, Ginsburg and Breyer and Sotomayor and Kagan, you just know how they're going to vote even before they hear oral arguments. That's not what the Supreme Court's supposed to do. Chelsey, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. We often joke sometimes that often we see these opinions that they're conclusions in search of a justification,
Yes.
especially when it comes to constitutional law. As the court's dynamics change, we find that their opinions sometimes waver. But Scalia himself did say, if you are a principled justice, you should ultimately have an outcome you personally disagree with.
Right.
And that's because you are applying the law as it's stated and interpreting the Constitution in a principled manner.
Let me tell my favorite story, and then I know you have some favorite quotes of Antonin Scalia. You know, back when I was at the 1984 Republican Convention, they had somebody burn a flag. And so then they asked, is flag burning protected under the First Amendment? And Scalia, although he disagreed with that action, still upheld that. The next morning, when he came down for breakfast, his wife was singing, "It's a grand old flag" at the breakfast table because she didn't like the decision, and he didn't like it either, but he had to be true to the Constitution. I can give all sorts of examples, and Debbie, I know you can as well, of some of these individuals like Anthony Kennedy and Harry Blackmun and John Roberts and Sandra Day O'Connor and all sorts of individuals that sometimes voted against what they would prefer because they felt the Constitution provided that. But you do not see that with the Democratic appointees.
You really don't. And another great example is just the quickest one on Justice Scalia, but it says so much. There was a case involving, and I don't know if it was a drone or some kind of flyover, where it took a heat radiated image and could locate and could discover that these people were growing marijuana, I guess, in their house or whatever they were doing. They were growing marijuana. It was illegal. And so the question was a Fourth Amendment search and seizure. Did you have the right to do this search? There was no search warrant permitting this aerial picture to be taken. Well, Justice Scalia was a conservative, and the conservative view is we're law and order. We don't like, people growing marijuana. But he had no problem saying this was an illegal search and therefore all the evidence must be thrown out.
There you
go. This is this notion that, this idea of justice being blind, it can only be blind if you are adhere to the Constitution. And what happens in the American left, and it's why they discovered a magical right for abortion in the Constitution and many other magical rights, that it becomes therefore just 9 unelected, unaccountable people essentially having the final say in law in America. And this is, it's very detrimental. And whatever you did or didn't like Scalia ruled, he was always at least basing it on what the Constitution says. And we need more Scalias on the court.
Let's take another phone call in South Carolina, WLPG this time. Hugh, thank you for joining our conversation today.
Thanks again, Kerby, for the privilege to do so and for your ministry. Last Monday when I spoke with you, I raised an issue that I want to again reference, probably with implications as to my thoughts on it, but I want to form it in the way of a question. Do you, the three of you, how many are there now, think that possibly if the Republican candidates would have stood firm on their constitutional belief that, yes, the president has a right and an obligation to appoint Supreme Court justices, and yes, the Senate has its duty and its responsibility to respond to that, not immediately, whatever, there's latitude there, that this whole issue, and they had not stated this controversial idea that the president should not even go that way. Do you think that this would have been a much less controversial issue in the whole campaign?
I think it would have been controversial anyway, but that's what I sometimes call an unforced error. When I play tennis, sometimes I talk about unforced error. It would have just been better, as I've said on there, the president has a right, Article 2, Section 2, has a right to appoint an individual, to nominate an individual, and then Supreme Court can decide after the fact about what that action is, but that's certainly within the Constitution. And then the Senate has the right to determine whether or not they're going to provide advice and consent. But by saying we just don't think the president should appoint, you may be given a little bit of ground to the other side. But what are your thoughts? Let's go around the round table.
Well, let's not forget that that this election isn't just a presidential election, that we Republicans are only holding the majority of the Senate by four seats, and that many of those seats are up for re-election this fall. And so the American people once again will have a choice to vote in what senators they would like to ultimately go through this confirmation process.
I may have a feistier point of view, but I think this president has run roughshod over the Constitution over and over and over in the last 7+ years. And I think the voters is the reason a major reason that they sent a Republican majority to the United States Senate in 2014. And I think the voters, especially in the presidential level, they're looking for strength from these candidates. They want to hear from these candidates, I see what President Obama's doing. I'm going to stop him, which is why the Republicans got the majority in 2014. So I think all the factors in today's world, I think it was completely appropriate to immediately speak up and say the Senate is simply not going to approve any nominees by this president, because we're at a constitutional crisis point in this country. It is not like a debate between the speed limit being 50 or 55. It's a constitutional crisis. Does the Constitution mean what it says or not?
We'll take a break. Come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Seth Shostak believes that this could be humanity's last century, but don't think that he's a pessimist. He's the director of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence and warns us about potential dangers on the horizon, but also explains that our 21st century technology holds great promise. He believes we will be able to understand biology at the molecular level. That will give humanity the ability to cure all diseases, but it will also usher in an era of designer babies. He believes we will eventually produce offspring that are as different from us as dogs are from gray wolves. He also believes that we will expand into space to obtain additional resources such as copper, zinc, and platinum. Humanity might establish colonies on the moon or Mars. We might also develop huge orbiting habitats in space. He also predicts that we will develop generalized artificial intelligence. This will allow machines to take over jobs normally done by humans, and it is impossible, at least in the near future, that robotics will be so advanced that it will be difficult to tell the difference between who is a real human and who is a machine. If his predictions are true, and I believe they're fairly accurate, then we will need wisdom and morality to guide us through these new advances. Put simply, we need Christian ethics and morality like never before. Unfortunately, the moral foundation behind much of these technological advances is a secular humanistic one. We need Christians in the fields of science and engineering to provide moral reflection. And we cannot retreat into a belief that Jesus will return before all of these technologies are developed. He may not return when we think that he might. We should not be preoccupied with his coming. We need to occupy until he comes. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Columbia Pictures, LD Entertainment, and Affirm Films present Risen, the resurrection through the eyes of a non-believer. Risen, rated PG-13 in theaters February 19th.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition here on Point of View, and we have in studio with us today David Georgatos and Chelsey Youman. And if you'd like to join us, I actually have some open lines for the first time, 1-800-351-1212. We've been talking about South Carolina, and most of our calls are from South Carolina. I have a Texan that I'm going to get to next because some others deserve a chance. But let's, for just a moment, talk about what's happening in Nevada. And this is significant because in Nevada, you have a caucus. And in this particular case, it has not gone as planned, at least for Hillary Clinton. Now, the caucus is not as significant, but there are 43 delegates at stake. And that, unfortunately, is still not going to help Bernie Sanders. This is odd because Bernie Sanders basically tied with Hillary Clinton. Even if Hillary Clinton won 6 coin tosses in a row, what are the chances that you get heads 6 times in a row? But that's the way it works, I guess. This time, if they are tied, they're going to pull a card out of a deck. But nevertheless, even though he tied in Iowa, essentially, and won 80-39 or 38 in South Carolina or in New Hampshire, she has 394 delegates. He has 44 because she has many of these super delegates. So this time you have 43 delegates at stake. But there are a lot of people, Debbie and Chelsey, that are actually turning against Hillary Clinton. One is the email scandal. You have Michael Mukasey saying that as a former attorney general, she should be indicted. And you have Bob Woodward of Washington Post fame and Watergate fame saying this reminds him of that. And then you have Bernie Sanders saying, I can't trust this woman because she received $675,000 in speaking fees from Goldman Sachs. And I think most Democrats are starting to figure out that if you receive that kind of money, they're not just paying you for an informative and entertaining speech. And so this has really hurt her. And what happens in Nevada could actually send more and more Democrats to Bernie Sanders. She probably will win South Carolina in a week, but in terms of the delegate count, and especially if Bernie Sanders wins a lot of caucuses and primaries, and then she wins because of the superdelegates, I predict that the Democratic Convention, we're old enough to remember the 1968 Democratic Convention, will be a source of major conflict, don't you think?
Absolutely, I do. And on the subject of Hillary, one other thing has changed so much, even since the last time she ran, is this dynamic about identity voting, just saying to young women, vote for Hillary because she's a woman. She's had two big gaffes in the last several weeks where people of Hillary's generation, women aren't buying it. In fact, Bernie Sanders, there's a lot of in and out polling in New Hampshire. Bernie Sanders won the youth vote. He won the young single women's vote. The only group Hillary won were the 65 and older and the people with net income annually of $200,000 or more. So the people who remember Bill or can see Bernie's going to take all the money away. But she's not winning these niches she counts on. And so It's a big deal in South Carolina if she can bring in the black vote.
Wow.
You know, in some ways, this is deja vu. We've seen this before in 2008, where the Democrats ultimately reject Hillary Clinton. In 2008, Obama gained a lot of momentum once he started winning. And I think that we've seen Bernie Sanders also gaining that momentum with women essentially defecting from Hillary and now voting for him. And also we've got her indictment in play. 50% of Democratic voters now say that they don't trust Hillary, which, you know, I think that number's almost double for Republicans, but they're starting to see this, and they might even be tired of the Clinton empire coming again.
Let's take some more phone calls. We've been going to South Carolina. Let's go to a couple other states here. Texas, KAVX. And Robert, I appreciate you waiting so long. What would you like to add to the conversation today?
Going way back in the conversation about who you'd vote for first and who you'd vote for second.
Very good. On the Republican side, yeah, what would you do?
Well, I'd go for Trump first and then Cruz second. We were talking about this at work this morning, and the guys were asking, well, how can you say that? You being a Christian, how can you vote for Trump over Cruz? Well, my point was two things. One, winnability. I think he's just simply got a more likely chance of winning. Secondly, about 5 months back, he made a comment about he doesn't need any lobbyist money, and if the Republicans didn't give him the nomination, no problem. He'd just run as a third-party independent. And that's what I've been waiting for. I've been waiting for a strong third-party independent, someone that didn't need the Republicans or the Democrats, didn't need a political party. They could go in there and do what's right because it's right, not because lobbyists paid them.
Hasn't worked well so far with the Ross Perot's and the Ralph Naders, but we'll see. And, of course, they're talking about Michael Bloomberg might run. Wouldn't that be interesting? 2 New Yorkers running as independents. Who knows?
Billionaires. Two billionaires, yeah.
Well, Robert, I appreciate that because some people are saying, can I really get my head around Donald Trump and as a Christian? And that is one of the questions we were going to ask yesterday of Robert Jeffress. He actually ended up being on Sean Hannity's program and had to tell us that maybe he'll do our program in the future because he was trying to defend Donald Trump on the issue of the Pope. So, and by the way, some of you want to talk about that in just a minute. But again, we'll see where that plays out. But Debbie, what do you want to add to the conversation?
Tiniest quick point to the caller. I was looking at the data from the time that Ross Perot did run, and it's one thing to win a percentage of voters and to have people split the vote up. But in 1996, Bill Clinton won 40.1% of the vote, but he had 370 of the 200, he only needed 370 at the Electoral College to win. The point being Ross Perot, whatever numbers he took away, he had 0 delegates, he had 0 votes Electoral College, and all he really did was give the country Bill Clinton.
Yes, for sure. And I think you could almost make the case that Ralph Nader might have given it to George W. Bush because he took away enough votes in Florida to actually hurt Al Gore. So usually the independent candidates certainly hurt someone, but not usually are they able to actually win a particular state. Because again, the Electoral College, you have to win the actual vote in a state so that you get those electoral votes to go to the Electoral College.
But I do think it is a very important point for Republicans to be cognizant of the general election and stay alongside it and think in terms of what candidate, when pitted against Hillary or a Sanders ticket, will ultimately win. And I think some of the polling indicates Rubio has consistently won in that mashup since, I think, December. And Cruz recently, as of this month, has gradually taken that ground. But Trump has consistently fell under the Hillary ticket or fell under a Sanders ticket.
Since you mentioned Marco Rubio, I want to take a phone call on Marco Rubio, if you don't mind. Let's go to South Carolina this time. Once again, I guess I should say, and talk to Jane. What would you like to talk about today?
Hi, Kerby. I love your show. Thank you. I don't get to listen often because I do work during the day.
I understand that.
I want to also, I've got a couple of things, if I could. I want, first of all, to go back to what you were just discussing, and that is who would you vote for? And the gentleman who is expressing his intent to vote for Trump, a number of people that I know that are Christians say that they will vote for Trump or even are planning to vote for Sanders in the Democratic primary.
Oh, yeah, switch over next week.
They are Republicans.
Yes.
Because with the sole intent of defeating Hillary.
A number of people tell me this now. This is not a small issue, I might just say. I see smiles around the table of individuals that are saying, even though I'm a Republican, I'm not going to vote tomorrow. I'm going to wait a week because it's an open primary, and then I'm going to go in and vote for Bernie Sanders so that I can defeat Hillary Clinton in South Carolina, which you're, by the way, free to do, right?
Absolutely. In 2008, I crossed over. I was one of those.
You're going to tell that story.
Yes, and I went and voted, and I had to end up at the Democratic caucus that night so that my vote would count, and I was wearing a Vote Red t-shirt, and Democrats were so up in arms, obviously, against me. But I do think in this election, with as many Republican candidates as we have running, we need to choose our candidate. And it's more important to choose a candidate as a Christian, and evangelicals need to be thinking in terms of religious liberty. This is not something we can fall asleep at the wheel about. We have many statements from the other side saying that they're hoping to eradicate our First Amendment rights in 3 to 5 years. So not only is this an important election for Republican issues, but as Christians, what candidates have you seen with a track record defending religious liberty? And I think that Cruz is at the top of the list for that. And Rubio also has, his religious liberty team that he's put together. And so don't forget to look at that issue and think what rights will be protected in 3 to 5 years from now.
So Debbie, we found out that Chelsey was part of that Operation Chaos 8 years ago, but she is not recommending that you do it now. She's 8 years wiser than she was when she did it then. Go ahead.
Yes, and that does, just kind of emphasize the turmoil, I believe, that this country is in and the stark fear.
Yes.
We have actually lost our values completely as far as the majority. I don't believe that, but if you listen to the media, that's what they would have you believe. And unfortunately, when you listen to many young people, and I hate to use a group because that's always casting something, because I know many, to the exception of the millennials and young college people who just seem to be entranced with socialism, or what
Gotta take a break. Worse. Sorry, I think we got your point, but we'll be back right after this.
A farmer will tell you that if you don't prepare the ground, if you never plant good seeds, don't expect a harvest. Weeds maybe, edible crop no. Achieving a positive result takes work and planning. If you're concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, in the halls of government, let me ask, have you invested in pulling weeds and planting seeds? That's what the Truth Team at Point of View does. For decades, God has used this team to attack noxious mental weeds and to plant seeds of truth that have grown into changed lives. If you're already giving to this effort each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net or using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, we will do our best to give as many of you a chance to join the conversation as possible. 1-800-351-1212. In studio, Debbie Georgatos, Chelsey Youman, and let's head up to New Hampshire. Of course, we had a primary up there, and last week I was giving everybody from New Hampshire a primary opportunity and get to go to the front of the line. This time, South Carolinians do. But I'll go back to New Hampshire because, Bob, WSEW, I think you want to put another issue on the table that we would like to discuss. So go for it.
Yes, I don't want to get ahead of your conversation. Thank you for taking my call, by the way. I just wanted to mention, the Pope mentioned, Donald Trump putting a fence up on the southern end of our country, to keep undesirables and other people that are not, Americans into the country. Well, it's a little bit hypocritical when you look at a bird's eye view of the Vatican country. They have a wall
and it's
around
a
their
big
whole
wall,
country,
too. I just looked it up. Yeah, go ahead.
It was because, as the screener mentioned, and I knew, was because the Muslims attacked them, and so they put a wall up. And so our idea of putting a wall up on just one end of our country, is a little bit less than putting one around your whole country, like the Vatican has done. I wonder why nobody's mentioned that fact. Any bird's eye view of the Vatican will show that their small country is encased by a wall.
If you look at that wall, it's at least 40 or 50 feet high. And they always say, he who lives in glass houses should not throw rocks. He who lives behind a wall should not criticize other people for building a wall. Is that at least
one wall?
Yeah.
One wall.
Well, that's a good point. What about this? Again, the Pope has a right to say anything, and many of our Catholic friends say, well, when the Pope speaks on political issues, he's not speaking ex cathedra. He's not necessarily claiming to be infallible and all that. And so he's free to say that. But at the same time, I think there have been a number of listeners this week that have said, this is just not something we would expect the Pope to address.
Absolutely. I actually look at this as two separate issues. If you want to question Trump's beliefs and whether he is in fact an evangelical Christian, he's made statements to the like about never asking for forgiveness for his sin. He has a track record of being pro-choice, now is pro-life, he says. But if you want to look at his track record as far as an evangelical Christian goes, that's one thing as a voter. But to say that you're not a Christian for building a wall, Rubio himself is talking about building a wall as part of his solution to the immigration policy, and no one is questioning Rubio's evangelical roots. And further, I think that the Pope might just not understand the crisis that we do have in our country with not just human trafficking over the border, but in addition to immigration issues, but also the threat of terrorists coming across our border.
Yeah, it seemed an oddly out-of-step thing for the Pope to say. He was just returning from a trip to Mexico, and there was some, in Donald Trump's response, some allusion to that of he's just saying what they told him to say or something like that. But I do think that this particular Pope is, we were talking about how Supreme Court justices should have blind justice and be neutral, and people think of the Pope as being a religious figure, but this is a particularly liberal and more socialist-minded Pope, and so he comes out with different conclusions. But the notion of not understanding in America why we need a wall and criticizing someone, that just seemed really out of beyond the Pope's scope of authority or something. And I will say Marco Rubio had a great comment, a great explanation of how he views the Pope's statements, not in response to this one, but in general, just, and I don't know the precise term, but, if he's speaking about scripture, I believe him to be absolutely always right. But if it's not infallible, thank you, because the other word, but otherwise, he's just a person I respect, but I don't feel like I have to salute. So it was fair enough.
Good enough. Since we're in New Hampshire, let's go down to Massachusetts for just a minute. WSEW. Pamela wanted to ask a kind of a basic question, and that's something I thought would be good with our panel. So, Pamela, you have the floor. What would you like to ask?
Hi. I was just curious, when a delegate is a delegate, how does that occur? How does that happen?
Certainly be glad to talk about that. Debbie, you get the first shot at that, and then I've got some things to add, too.
Just very quickly, every state makes their own procedure for that, but I was a delegate to the 2012 convention, the GOP convention in Tampa. And the basic thing is, in every state, you usually start with the smallest little, on primary voting day, you attend the caucus. At the end of the day, you try to you ask to be voted in as a delegate to in Texas's case, the county convention, and then to the state convention. So each time it's a winnowing down of the field, and so you're voted on by your fellow people who are seeking to become delegates. There's a lot of trading and power but you essentially have to follow the process in your state and finally be chosen as a national delegate.
And that's really very helpful because I've been a delegate to the state convention. You and Kelly Shackelford have been delegates to the national convention, just to mention a few. And so that's why you get involved in your various elections, because you can vote twice when you vote. You vote that day, and then you come back to the precinct meeting that night. Now, it's different in a couple states, but I'm going to give you a general thing. And then from there, you go from your precinct convention to your senatorial convention. Then you go to your state convention, and eventually the national one. Now, that's how it works in the Republican Party. Democrats are a little different.
You pay money? No.
Yeah. You have in the Democratic Party 700 superdelegates, which is why I think Hillary Clinton could still win, even if she loses lots of primaries. Now, who are these superdelegates? You can actually go to Wikipedia, and it gives you the list of all those. And when you go there, you will find that they are former presidential candidates like Walter Mondale. They're governors like Governor Cuomo, or those of us who lived in California, Governor Moonbeam, we used to call him, or some of those. Some of them are party officials. And so there, it's a little different because even though you have to have 2,300 actual delegates for your nomination, you can recognize that if the top 700 say they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and they don't all necessarily do that, it shows how less important the caucuses and the primaries are. So there is a real interesting conflict brewing there in the Democratic Party. Think about that for just a minute. And so that's the case. But if you would like to be a delegate, just like Debbie was, to the national convention, show up at your precinct convention. And then maybe you'll get moved along and you'll actually be able to, in the case of the Republicans, go to Cleveland and actually cast your vote. One more thing we might mention, Debbie, when you were selected as a delegate, you had to agree with, and at least on the first ballot, vote for the nominee. So whether it was John McCain or Mitt Romney, whoever it might be, right?
Exactly. And every delegate at this convention in Cleveland will have to cast a ballot, however their state divides up, whether they say they have proportional or they have winner take all.
Yeah.
You're told, that's how you have to vote. But if that first vote does not result in a victor, someone who's won the ballot and won the nomination, then you are freed and you kind of enter into the free-for-all.
We're in the Chelsea's brokered convention. I'm glad to have somebody else thinking that at least that's a possibility, because Kelly kind of shut that down last week. But I think that's still a possibility. But it only is a possibility if people like Carson and Bush and Kasich and some others stay in the running. Otherwise, it's not. Let's take a few more phone calls here. Kelly in South Carolina, WAGP. I think you would like to address the election that is taking place tomorrow in your state. So what would you like to share with us?
Well, thanks for taking my call. I appreciate this show so much. What I want to say is I want to return to the days when parents and teachers, I'm a homeschool teacher, could point to our president and say to their kids, see that man, our president, he's a leader, a man of integrity, someone you can look up to, a hero. He'll fight for our country and our rights, our freedom. And like us, he knows what makes America great. Well, here's my dilemma. I know Ted Cruz is the conservative candidate, but I'm having a hard time overlooking some negative remarks and some of his, I guess you would say, questionable campaigning tactics. I really like Ben Carson's demeanor, his character. He acts like an adult. I teach my kids many things, but character is at the top of the list. So it's hard to choose between a man's character and, his conservative views, how he's voted in the past, because I do believe in a lot of Ted Cruz's, the things he's done in the past. I heard him speak recently. I think he's a fantastic gentleman. Just, I don't know, there's a check in my spirit, I guess you would say. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Well, I think it's worthwhile. You know, I've said before that whatever happens to Ben Carson, I mean, he's going to be a hero. I hope he serves in the administration. I don't think he's going to be the president. If he was the president, I think there would be people that would have his picture in their home, because there's been a long time since we've had presidents which have such character that people have. I mean, I just don't think I've been in a home lately that's had a picture of Bill Clinton or Barack Obama on the mantle. But you know that but I remember going into homes where I saw Ronald Reagan's picture, and I'm old enough to remember there were pictures where you had Dwight Eisenhower, Harry Truman, but not lately. So I understand what she's saying there. Any comments?
I just think it's really important in this campaign season. You mentioned you heard Ted Cruz speak. I think this, especially the South Carolina primary, is notoriously among the most just aggressive, angry, accusatory, just full of venom. And so be sure you're actually hearing what the candidate said, not what his opponent said he said.
Good point. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
I never thought I'd hear conservatives vying to show who is most supportive of registering young women for the draft. But it happened in a recent GOP presidential debate. The question was relevant because recently, all restrictions against allowing women to be assigned to combat positions were lifted. Certain military leaders are talking about requiring women to sign up for selective service just as men do. It's the logical next step because the 1981 court decision prohibiting drafting women was based upon their exclusion from combat. Here's the question ABC News debate moderator Martha Raddatz directed at Marco Rubio. Many of you have young daughters. Senator Rubio, should young women be required to sign up for selective service in case of a national emergency? He prefaced his response with support for women serving in combat as long as standards are not compromised, and then continued, I do believe that selective service should be opened up for both men and women in case a draft is ever instituted. Martha Raddatz turned the question to Jeb Bush, asking him, do you believe that young women should sign up for selective service, be required to do so? Governor Bush answered, I do. His answer communicated that he does not think the draft will be reinstated, and there was an exchange about military readiness and morale. And then Chris Christie jumped in, mentioning he's the father of 2 daughters, and, quote, there is no reason why one young woman should be discriminated against from registering for the selective service. It's not about discriminating against women. It's about requiring them, making them sign up for selective service, so that if we ever have a draft again, they could be drafted. Political correctness has run amok in the military, so I'm not shocked the idea of drafting women is being floated. But for mainstream politicians to accept the idea that we as a country would ever force women into military service and into harm's way in combat positions is, to say the least, worrisome. Ted Cruz wasn't asked about drafting women that night. He told his audience at a town hall a few days later that as his fellow candidates answered the question, he was thinking, are you guys nuts? He said the idea that we would draft our daughters to forcibly bring them into the military and put them in close combat, I think, is wrong. It is immoral. It's been 40 years since we had a military draft in this country. There's currently no sign that will reinstate the draft. Congress is supposed to approve or disapprove consequential changes in military policy, and a discussion is beginning. Congressman Duncan Hunter, a Marine veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, introduced the Draft America's Daughters Act, not to pass it, but to start discussion so this isn't forced on the country. We must never draft America's daughters. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Full bank of phone calls. No way we'll get to all of them, but we'll do our best. Debbie Georgatos and Chelsey Youman. And let's go to Ken in Georgia, listening on the Good News Network. Ken, what would you add to our conversation today?
Good afternoon, Kerby. I just heard the call from the lady, and I believe she was from South Carolina, who was really like Ted Cruz, but was upset about some of the things. And yes, that was not a pretty sight of the debate there in South Carolina last week.
True.
But I would recommend, and I think my wife and I are going to pull the lever for Ted Cruz I believe he's the most conservative. And I wish he had a little bit of better delivery of his positions, but I believe he's the best man in my position of all the, what we might say, 2 or 3 good conservatives in the field. Pastor Ron Phillips of Abba's House in Chattanooga, Tennessee, recently posted a good article titled "In Search of the Perfect Candidate." Well, guess what? There's not one.
There's only one perfect person, and though. But again, we're not voting for a person that is the pastor or always Mr. Congeniality. We are recognizing that what is at stake is the future of this country. Who would you like to defend this country? Who would you like to begin to select Supreme Court nominees? Who would you like to begin to rein in the size and scope of government? When you start asking those questions, it narrows down to a smaller group, doesn't it?
Yes, sir. I just listened to the, while I was waiting for you to come back online with your program, the Penedextra commentary about drafting our daughters. It is a I hate to say sorry, a country that believes, and I know Israel is a different situation, and should it ever come to it that we needed daughters, our young ladies, to serve in the military, that's one thing. But I just can't believe that Duncan Hunter would have introduced legislation about starting the discussion of drafting our young daughters, young ladies, to serve in the military, be conscripted in a draft. To me, that tells you the sign of the times and a disastrous outcome for this country.
I just might mention again, you were listening to, I was online. We also, at the quarter hour, just before the top of the hour, play the commentary by Penedextra. And so if people would like to read it or hear it, it's available there. And again, Ken, I appreciate some of those comments. Anything about choosing a candidate? You've looked at Ted Cruz and probably have interacted with him, Chelsey. So what are your thoughts?
I have. I do think that while you can't perfectly predict what a president will do when he ultimately does become president, we do have track records for Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio both, and they both have very conservative track records. It's a matter of degree for policy that separates them. I know Ted Cruz has dedicated his career to defending religious liberty and under God in our allegiance at both the Texas state level and the U.S. Supreme Court, and he volunteered for First to Liberty for the Mojave Desert Veterans Memorial.
Yes, you worked with him on that. Mm-hmm.
Yes, he's been very, very proactive in protecting Christians and faith-based minorities in our country who are undergoing persecution. On the other side of that, Marco Rubio has had quite a few videos come out from his speaking engagements where he has defended his personal faith,
yes,
both to an atheist and someone else who had questions for him about his religious background, and he did so very eloquently, succinctly, and I think very believably. So those would be some indicators you can look at to know a little bit more about their beliefs.
I love everything she just said. Ditto. I think that's exactly right. There are actually voting records to look at, and it does matter. And if someone in conduct over the years, so if they've never held office, what positions have they taken? How recently was it? I mean, lots of people genuinely develop and change their viewpoints. They're young, they're maybe pro-choice because they think it's about being independent women or something, and they get older and they figure things out. But do you sense a genuine change of heart in somebody who has said fairly contradictory things very recently? It's a really vital thing to try to use the evidence you have, the internet gives you right in front of you.
Let's, if we can, maybe talk about some of the biblical qualifications for president. I know Randy wants to share those with us. I even did a commentary where one of the individuals, Thomas Kidd, who's been on the program, talked about the religiously perfect president. But Randy, I think you have some comments from Franklin Graham about how we select a president. So share those with us, if you might.
Well, Franklin Graham has said Americans need to vote for candidates that stand for biblical principles and truth and are willing to live by them. That pretty much eliminates a lot of the Republicans. The Democrats definitely. Exodus 18:21 says God told Israel to choose men for rulers that love God, fear truth, and hate covetousness. Well, that certainly eliminates Donald Trump. You'll never convince me that Jesus would vote for Trump, a man who's in an adulterous marriages, has strip clubs in his casino, wants to abuse eminent domain, and advocates for waterboarding and torture.
So who would you pick out of that? I figured you would disagree with Donald Trump, but are there any of the Republican candidates that you think might fit that criteria?
No, there's no Republican running, no. Ted Cruz is a neocon conservative, a neocon warmonger, according to Ron Paul, putting aside the question of his citizenship. He's in the pocket of Goldman Sachs, as Mr. Paul puts it. So that
not Ben Carson, not Marco Rubio. Do you think all of them are disqualified? Is that your comment?
Common Core. Rubio is for the Project for New American Century. Rubio is for enlarging the wars, unlawful and unconstitutional, unjust war.
So I guess you're probably just not going to vote for anybody. So I was thinking we might get a little more positive list, but I didn't quite come up with that. But if nothing else, that's the case. Let's go to Nick in South Carolina. We only got about a minute. Anything you'd like to share with us?
Yes, sir. The first thing I'd like to say is I kind of had an epiphany this morning about Donald Trump, and I was going to say that he was godless, but his God is money. And the other thing was...
Who would you pick then? I know we're going to get all the people I don't like Trump, but anybody that you think you might pick out of that list of 6?
Oh, Ted Cruz.
Okay, you would be a Cruz fan, okay.
But the thing about Donald Trump, you were talking yesterday about the Antichrist and how people would follow him. Well, I'm not saying that Donald Trump is the Antichrist, but he has never repented because he said he's never done anything wrong. And
no need to ask for forgiveness if you've never made a mistake. That's a deal breaker for me, and I think most of the people around the table. Any final comment? I'm just about out of time.
I understand. But for the Christians to follow him answers my question about how they're going to follow the Antichrist.
Okay. I think I got it. Unfortunately, I'm out of time, and I'm not out of phone calls. I've got an entire full bank of phone calls, but you just run out of time. And Debbie, you know how that is, because sometimes on Saturday or Sunday night, you're going, 2 hours is not enough, right?
Absolutely.
I have 2 hours every day, and it's not enough.
I love the energy this election season is bringing out among the American people. I think so many people are tuned in who haven't been tuned in, honestly, for years and maybe decades because they see our country going off a cliff in many directions and they want to bring America back. I was only 1 minute left. Next time I'm on, I have my top 5 things you must have in the presidential candidate.
Okay, well, we'll do that soon. I do want to give Chelsey a chance to mention again, First Liberty is a great place to go and find all the great resources you have there, right?
Yes. We have many, many cases on a national scale that will affect your individual religious liberty rights. They're very exciting cases. If you'll go to firstliberty.org, you can read more about us.
Yeah, and it's a new website. So you're not only a new name and new logo, but a new website. You'll love it. Chelsey, this has been a lot of fun. You think you might want to come back again?
Absolutely. This has been great.
Well, again, Debbie loves this. She calls this show prep, right?
My free show prep, yes.
Well, if nothing else, those of you that would like to listen to her on Sunday, you can do so. And, of course, we have the links on the website since we're running out of time. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. All those in South Carolina, you vote. We'll talk about it on Monday. We'll see you back there then.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of